The encounter. Marcus Davis sat on a worn wooden bench in Riverside Park, absorbing the quiet beauty of his surroundings. The late afternoon sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled light onto the grassy lawns. He loved this park, a sanctuary amidst the urban sprawl where he could find a moment of peace. With a paperback novel resting in his hands, he leaned back, savoring the quiet rustle of leaves and the occasional laughter of children playing in the distance. For Marcus, these moments were precious. They were a chance to disconnect from the intensity of his daily life as a dedicated FBI agent. Across the park, Officer Brian Harkins patrolled his usual beat. Brian was a seasoned cop, 20 years on the force, and he prided himself on knowing the city better than anyone else. His job wasn't easy, and he'd learned to trust his gut when something felt off. Today, as he scanned the park, his gaze fell upon Marcus. There was nothing unusual about a man sitting on a bench reading, but something in Marcus's calm demeanor, his relaxed posture, his focused expression, stirred a sense of unease in Brian. A black man sitting alone, too calm, too composed. In Brian's mind, that alone was suspicious. He'd never seen this man around here before, and he hadn't earned his instincts by ignoring the unknown. As his eyes lingered on Marcus, Brian's hand moved to rest on his belt, where his baton and handcuffs were hooked, just in case. Brian muttered to himself, "Never seen him around here before." He continued to watch Marcus, his stance stiffening as he considered his options. Over the years, Brian had learned to trust the subtle gut feelings that sometimes guided his actions. Today, his gut was telling him that Marcus didn't belong, that he was hiding something. He took a few measured steps forward, watching Marcus closely. Marcus felt the officer's gaze on him and looked up from his book. He'd noticed the officer's scrutiny a few moments ago, but had chosen to ignore it, hoping to avoid an unnecessary confrontation. But now, with Brian moving closer, Marcus knew he was being targeted. He'd seen that look before, suspicion tinged with prejudice, wrapped in a guise of just doing my job. Marcus didn't flinch or look away. He simply closed his book, marking the page with his finger, and met Brian's gaze calmly. His face was expressionless, unreadable. He'd been in situations like this too many times to count, and he'd learned that showing any kind of nervousness or irritation would only fuel the officer's suspicion. Brian didn't like the way Marcus looked back at him. There was something unsettling about the man's calmness, his lack of fear. It was as though Marcus knew something Brian didn't, and that thought made him uneasy. In an attempt to assert control over the situation, Brian adjusted his stance and moved forward, making his presence even more apparent. "Afternoon," Brian said, his tone neutral but with an edge that Marcus could detect immediately. "Afternoon," Marcus replied, his voice steady. He kept his hands visible, resting them on the closed book in his lap. He'd seen interactions like this go wrong before, and he wasn't about to give the officer any excuse to escalate the situation. Brian eyed Marcus suspiciously, his gaze moving from the man's face to the book in his hands. "What brings you out here today?" "Just enjoying the park. It's a nice day," Marcus answered, keeping his tone polite yet firm. He maintained eye contact with Brian, not wanting to give the officer any sign of weakness or fear. The officer nodded slowly, though he wasn't really listening to the answer. His mind was racing, trying to piece together a justification for his suspicions. "You from around here?" he asked, fishing for more information. Marcus offered a small smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "I've been around." It was a carefully neutral response, one that gave Brian nothing to latch onto. The non-answer irked Brian, and he shifted his stance to something more confrontational. "Mind if I see some ID?" he asked, a hint of authority creeping into his voice. Marcus's smile faded, and he regarded Brian carefully. He knew he wasn't obligated to show ID simply for sitting in a public park, but he also understood that refusing could lead to unnecessary complications. Yet he wasn't one to be intimidated easily, and he wasn't in the mood to play along with an officer's baseless suspicions. "Am I under arrest?" Marcus asked, his tone even, his gaze unwavering. Brian bristled at the question, a surge of frustration coursing through him. He didn't like being questioned, especially not by someone who seemed so unfazed by his authority. "You will be if you don't cooperate," Brian shot back, his hand moving subtly toward his holster. The implication was clear, and it hung heavy in the air between them. Marcus took a slow, calming breath, keeping his expression neutral. He wasn't intimidated, but he didn't like the direction this was heading. He knew he could stand his ground, could push back against the officer's intimidation tactics, but he also understood that in situations like these, asserting his rights could easily be twisted into resisting. "I'm just sitting in a park," Marcus replied, his voice calm but firm. "Is there a law against that?" Brian's patience was wearing thin. His instincts told him something was wrong, even if he couldn't pinpoint what. "You fit the description of someone we're looking for," he said, though even he knew how weak the excuse sounded. Marcus raised an eyebrow, his eyes narrowing slightly. "And what description is that?" he asked quietly. Brian's jaw tightened. He didn't have a good answer, and he knew it. But admitting that would mean conceding control, and his pride wouldn't allow it. Instead, he took a step closer, looming over Marcus with a hard stare. "Don't get smart with me," he snapped. "Show me some ID. Now." The tension was thick, nearly tangible. Marcus knew he could assert his rights, could stand up and walk away, but he also knew the risks. He'd been in situations where the smallest resistance had been twisted against him, and he wasn't interested in being another statistic. So, reluctantly, he decided to comply for now. Without breaking eye contact, Marcus slowly reached into his pocket, making sure his movements were deliberate. He withdrew his wallet, keeping his other hand visible, and handed over his ID without a word. Brian snatched it from his hand, scanning the name and address without much interest. The name didn't ring any bells, but that didn't matter. Brian had already made up his mind. "Stand up," Brian ordered, stepping back to give Marcus room. Marcus sighed inwardly, his frustration mounting, but he rose from the bench without resistance. He kept his hands visible, making sure not to give Brian any reason to claim he felt threatened. The officer's gaze was unrelenting, and Marcus could feel the weight of it pressing down on him as if he were already guilty of some imagined crime. "Turn around," Brian said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. Marcus's jaw tightened, a surge of indignation rising within him, but he suppressed it. He turned around, allowing Brian to cuff him without a fight. He could hear the murmurs of people nearby, could feel their curious stares, but he kept his composure. As the cold metal bit into his wrists, Marcus felt a deep weariness settle over him. This wasn't the first time he'd been in a situation like this, and it wouldn't be the last. Despite his achievements, his respectability, his position, moments like these reminded him of the ever-present shadow of prejudice that followed him, even in the simplest acts. Brian, on the other hand, felt a nagging sense of unease creeping in as he secured the cuffs around Marcus's wrists. Something about the situation didn't feel right, but he couldn't place it. Still, his pride wouldn't allow him to back down now. He grabbed Marcus's arm and began leading him toward the patrol car parked nearby. As they walked, Marcus remained silent, his gaze steady and unfocused. He knew the system well, knew that his identity would soon come to light, and the irony of it all made him almost smile. For now, he allowed the officer to believe he was in control, knowing that the truth would soon reveal itself in the most unexpected way. And so Marcus, an FBI agent who dedicated his life to justice, was led toward a squad car by an officer who saw only the color of his skin and not the man beneath it. The story was just beginning, and as the car pulled away from the park, Marcus's mind was already racing, formulating the next steps in a confrontation that would reveal far more than either man expected. Realizations and revelations. The police car moved steadily through the city streets, the hum of the engine and the rhythmic clatter of wheels on pavement filling the silence inside. Marcus sat quietly in the back seat, his hands cuffed behind him, his gaze fixed on the passing scenery. Despite the situation, he remained calm, his expression serene. He'd been through enough of these experiences to know that letting emotions take over would only make things worse. This time, however, he was armed not just with patience, but with knowledge that would soon turn the tables. The officer driving the car had no idea who he had just arrested. Up front, Officer Brian Harkins gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white. His mind raced, replaying the events in the park. He couldn't shake the feeling that he'd lost control of the situation back there, that Marcus had somehow unnerved him without even trying. That calm, steady gaze, the confidence, the lack of fear. There was something about this man that made Brian feel exposed, as if his authority had been questioned without a single word of defiance. It bothered him more than he cared to admit. Unable to bear the silence, Brian glanced at Marcus in the rearview mirror. "What were you really doing in that park?" he asked, his voice edged with suspicion, as if searching for validation for his actions. Marcus met Brian's eyes in the mirror, his face composed. "I told you," he replied calmly. "I was just reading." Brian scoffed, a sharp, derisive sound. "A guy like you, just sitting around reading. You expect me to believe that? A guy like me?" Marcus repeated softly, his tone even, almost curious. It was a question that hung in the air, loaded with unspoken implications. Marcus knew exactly what Brian meant, even if the officer couldn't bring himself to say it out loud. Brian's jaw tightened. He knew he'd made a misstep, but his pride wouldn't let him backtrack. "You don't look like someone who spends his afternoons reading in the park," he said, his tone defensive, as if trying to justify his own assumptions. Marcus allowed the silence to stretch, his gaze never wavering. "And what does someone like me look like, Officer Harkins?" he asked quietly. Brian didn't answer. He couldn't. Deep down, he knew that he had crossed a line, that his assumptions were based on prejudice rather than reason, but he wasn't ready to confront that truth. Instead, he focused on the road, his frustration mounting as Marcus's calm demeanor continued to unsettle him. The precinct came into view, a squat, gray building that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the afternoon light. Brian pulled into the parking lot, guiding the patrol car into a spot near the entrance. He got out first, taking a moment to steady himself before opening the back door and helping Marcus out. As he gripped Marcus's arm, guiding him toward the building, he couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was about to go very wrong. Inside the precinct, the usual buzz of activity filled the air. Officers were busy filing reports, taking phone calls, and processing other suspects. Conversations overlapped, phones rang, and the hum of fluorescent lights added a sterile, almost oppressive quality to the atmosphere. As Brian led Marcus through the main hall, curious glances followed them. Some officers raising their eyebrows at the sight of the cuffed man being escorted by Officer Harkins. Brian ignored the looks, his face set in a mask of professionalism, though inwardly he felt a twinge of embarrassment. He didn't want to explain himself just yet, not until he was certain he'd made the right call. The last thing he needed was for his colleagues to think he'd acted on impulse rather than solid evidence. They reached the booking area, where a young officer named Jenkins was stationed behind the desk. Jenkins was fresh out of the academy, eager and inexperienced, but diligent in his duties. He looked up as Brian approached, his eyes flicking from Marcus to Brian with a hint of confusion. "What's this about, Officer Harkins?" Jenkins asked, his gaze shifting to Marcus, then back to Brian. "Caught him acting suspicious in the park," Brian replied, his tone clipped. He handed over Marcus's ID, still unwilling to admit that he didn't have a solid reason for the arrest. Jenkins took the ID, glancing at the name before typing it into the computer. Marcus watched him closely, noting the young officer's initial reaction, a brief flicker of recognition that Jenkins quickly masked. Marcus's instincts told him that Jenkins knew who he was, or at least suspected it. It was a subtle moment, but one that Marcus filed away in his mind, knowing that it could play to his advantage. "Captain Bennett's in her office," Jenkins said, handing the ID back to Brian. "You'll need to take him to her." Brian hesitated, a flicker of apprehension crossing his face. Captain Laura Bennett was known for her strict adherence to procedure and her no-nonsense attitude. She didn't tolerate mistakes or poor judgment, and Brian knew that she would scrutinize every detail of his arrest. He hadn't planned on involving her so soon, but Jenkins was right. Protocol demanded that he report this to her. "All right," Brian muttered, his voice tight. He turned to Marcus, his grip firm on the man's arm. "Let's go." Marcus walked beside Brian, his expression still unreadable, but inwardly he noted the tension radiating from the officer. Brian was on edge, uncertain, and it showed. The cracks in his confidence were becoming more evident, and Marcus felt a quiet satisfaction in knowing that the tables were beginning to turn. They made their way through the precinct to Captain Bennett's office, a corner room with a large window overlooking the city. Brian knocked on the door, waiting until he heard Captain Bennett's voice from inside. "Come in." The office was neatly organized, with a large desk in the center and shelves lined with books and files. Captain Laura Bennett sat behind the desk, her sharp eyes fixed on Brian as he entered with Marcus in tow. She was a woman in her early 40s, known for her keen intellect and unyielding sense of justice. Her reputation as a fair but tough leader preceded her, and Brian knew that he would need to tread carefully. "Officer Harkins," she said, her tone neutral as her gaze shifted to Marcus. Her eyes narrowed slightly, a hint of recognition flashing across her face, but she quickly masked it, keeping her expression professional. "What's this about?" Brian cleared his throat, his grip on Marcus's arm tightening slightly. "Caught this guy in the park, Captain. He was acting suspicious, wouldn't cooperate when I asked for ID." Captain Bennett's gaze shifted back to Marcus, her expression unreadable. She assessed him quietly, her eyes taking in the calm, composed demeanor, the steady gaze. There was something about Marcus that she recognized, a quiet authority, an air of professionalism that was out of place in this context. And then it clicked. "Marcus Davis," she said softly, though her voice held an edge. "FBI, if I'm not mistaken." The words hung in the air, and Brian felt his stomach drop. He turned to Marcus, a look of shock and disbelief crossing his face. This man, the man he had handcuffed and arrested without cause, was a federal agent. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut, and he struggled to process the implications. Marcus met Captain Bennett's gaze, giving her a small nod. "Yes, ma'am," he replied, his voice steady. "Special Agent Marcus Davis." Captain Bennett's expression remained calm, but there was a steely glint in her eyes as she turned her attention back to Brian. "Officer Harkins," she said, her tone icy, "perhaps you'd like to explain exactly what prompted you to arrest Special Agent Davis in a public park." Brian opened his mouth, but no words came out. He felt a bead of sweat trickle down his temple as he struggled to come up with an answer. His mind raced, searching for a justification, but all he could remember was that nagging feeling, that baseless suspicion he'd felt when he saw Marcus sitting on the bench. He knew there was no good answer, no excuse that would absolve him. Captain Bennett raised an eyebrow, waiting for his response. When it became clear that he had none, she sighed, her disappointment evident. "I'll handle this from here, Officer Harkins. You're dismissed." Brian hesitated, his pride wounded, but he knew better than to argue. He nodded stiffly, casting one last, bewildered glance at Marcus before turning and leaving the office. The door closed behind him, and silence settled over the room. Captain Bennett leaned back in her chair, regarding Marcus with a thoughtful expression. "I apologize for the treatment you received, Agent Davis," she said, her voice sincere. "It appears that some members of our force still have a lot to learn." Marcus nodded, though his face remained impassive. "I appreciate your apology, Captain, but I'm afraid this isn't an isolated incident. I've encountered officers like Harkins too many times to count." Captain Bennett sighed, a look of regret flashing across her face. "I'm aware. It's something I'm working to address, but change comes slowly." Marcus met her gaze, his expression softening slightly. "I understand, Captain. But as long as officers like Harkins are allowed to operate unchecked, there will be more incidents like this." Captain Bennett nodded solemnly, understanding the weight of his words. She knew that Marcus was right, and the encounter with him had only underscored the need. Confrontation and reflection. Captain Bennett's office was quiet, a stark contrast to the bustling precinct outside. The air between her and Marcus held an unspoken tension as they sat across from each other, the weight of their recent exchange lingering. Captain Bennett took a steady breath, mentally preparing herself for what would likely be a difficult conversation. Marcus's calm gaze never wavered, but there was a strength in his demeanor, a quiet resilience that spoke volumes. "Agent Davis," she began, her tone softer now, though still laced with authority. "I can't change what's happened, but I want to understand it. And more than that, I want to make sure incidents like this don't continue to occur under my watch." Marcus allowed himself a small nod, acknowledging her sincerity. "Captain, I appreciate that, but I've heard similar assurances before." His voice was calm, almost resigned, but there was a subtle challenge embedded within his words. Captain Bennett's brow furrowed. She had risen through the ranks, dedicating her life to the pursuit of justice, and prided herself on leading a fair and disciplined precinct. But Marcus's words hinted at a broader problem, one that extended beyond her office and into the fabric of the entire system. She had always suspected it, but hearing it so directly from someone who had experienced it firsthand made it all the more real. "Tell me," she said carefully, leaning forward, "what went through your mind when Officer Harkins approached you in the park?" Marcus tilted his head, his eyes thoughtful as he considered her question. "Honestly, Captain, the same thing that goes through my mind every time I'm confronted by an officer who sees only the color of my skin and not the person behind it." He paused, measuring his words. "I assessed the situation, calculated the risks, and prepared myself to de-escalate. Because, unfortunately, the burden of de-escalation often falls on people like me." Bennett nodded slowly, a sense of discomfort settling over her. She was accustomed to dealing with criminals, rule breakers, and people who tested the boundaries of the law. But hearing Marcus describe his experience, a trained federal agent, forced to defend his humanity in the face of prejudice, hit closer to home than she expected. This wasn't a criminal. This was someone who shared her commitment to justice, someone who had dedicated his life to upholding the very values she believed in. "It's infuriating," she admitted, her tone laced with genuine frustration. "I wish I could say that Officer Harkins's actions were an anomaly, but the truth is, this kind of behavior is more common than I'd like to admit, and as much as I try to root it out, it lingers." Marcus's face softened slightly, understanding the internal struggle she was grappling with. "I don't envy your position, Captain. You're responsible for enforcing policies, but you're also dealing with individuals who bring their own biases to the job. It's a complex problem, one that won't be solved overnight." She sighed, nodding. "But it's one I refuse to ignore. And I promise you, Agent Davis, that I'll be having a long conversation with Officer Harkins. His actions today were unacceptable." Marcus appreciated her resolve, though he knew that the issue ran deeper than just one officer. "I respect that, Captain. But Officer Harkins's actions are just a symptom of a larger disease. Until we address the root causes, until we educate and hold people accountable, incidents like this will keep happening." Captain Bennett's expression was solemn as she absorbed his words. She could see the years of exhaustion in his eyes, a weariness that came from countless experiences like today's. Marcus Davis was a seasoned federal agent, but he was also a black man who had lived through prejudice, subtle and overt, all his life. This wasn't just about one encounter. It was a lifetime of enduring the same indignities, time and time again. "Would you be willing to speak to my officers?" she asked suddenly, a spark of determination in her eyes. "Not just about this incident, but about your experiences, your perspective as both an agent and a citizen. I think they need to hear it." Marcus was taken aback, not expecting the invitation. He had done training sessions before, speaking to new recruits about interagency cooperation, surveillance, and fieldwork, but this was different. He'd never been asked to speak openly about the prejudice he faced, especially not in a precinct where he'd just been treated as a suspect rather than a colleague. He hesitated, considering the weight of the offer. "You really think they'd listen, Captain?" Bennett's gaze was steady. "If they know what's good for them, they will. And if they don't, I'll make sure they do." A small, appreciative smile tugged at Marcus's lips. "In that case, I'd be willing to share my experiences, but understand, Captain, that it won't be easy for some of them to hear. And it might not be easy for you to hear either." She met his gaze, unwavering. "I wouldn't have it any other way, Agent Davis." The two sat in silence for a moment, a mutual respect settling between them. But before the conversation could continue, there was a sharp knock at the door. Officer Jenkins entered, his face a mix of apprehension and curiosity. His eyes flicked from Captain Bennett to Marcus, lingering a moment longer on the latter. "Captain," he began, "there's someone here to see Agent Davis." Both Marcus and Bennett exchanged surprised glances. Marcus hadn't informed anyone of his whereabouts, and he wasn't expecting visitors. He raised an eyebrow, silently prompting Jenkins to elaborate. It's a higher-up from the Bureau," Jenkins explained, looking slightly out of his depth. "Special Agent in charge, Robert Larkin." Marcus's expression shifted, his demeanor becoming more formal. SAC Robert Larkin was his direct superior, a man known for his no-nonsense approach and unwavering loyalty to his agents. If Larkin was here, it meant he was aware of the situation, and he wasn't happy about it. "Please send him in," Captain Bennett said, her voice calm but with a hint of tension. She knew that dealing with an FBI superior wasn't something to take lightly, especially under these circumstances. Moments later, SAC Robert Larkin entered the room. He was a tall, imposing man in his 50s, with graying hair and a steely gaze that could make even the most hardened criminals falter. His presence commanded respect, and his reputation as a dedicated but fierce leader preceded him. "Marcus," Larkin greeted, his tone warm yet professional. He extended a hand, and Marcus shook it, feeling a sense of reassurance in the firm grip. "SAC Larkin," Marcus replied, acknowledging his superior with a respectful nod. Larkin's gaze shifted to Captain Bennett, his expression neutral but assessing. "Captain Bennett, I presume." She nodded, extending a hand as well. "Yes, Special Agent Larkin. It's a pleasure to meet you, though I wish it were under different circumstances." "Likewise," Larkin said, his tone polite but clipped. "I received word about what happened here today, and I felt it was necessary to address the matter in person." Captain Bennett nodded, meeting his gaze without hesitation. "I understand, Agent Larkin, and I assure you, we're taking this incident very seriously. Officer Harkins acted on his own accord, without proper cause, and I intend to address his actions accordingly." Larkin's eyes flicked to Marcus, as if silently assessing his agent's well-being. "I appreciate your swift response, Captain. However, this isn't just about Officer Harkins. This is about ensuring that agents like Marcus, who serve their country with dedication and integrity, are treated with the respect they deserve, regardless of the color of their skin." Captain Bennett felt a pang of discomfort but nodded resolutely. "I agree, and that's exactly why I've asked Agent Davis to speak to my officers about his experiences. I believe it's crucial for them to hear his perspective firsthand." Larkin's expression softened slightly, a hint of approval in his gaze. "That's a commendable decision, Captain. Too often, these issues are swept under the rug, ignored until they erupt into something larger. Confronting it directly is the right course of action." Marcus listened quietly, feeling an unexpected sense of solidarity between the two leaders. He hadn't anticipated this level of support, but he welcomed it. For too long, he had felt like he was fighting these battles alone, but today he saw a glimmer of hope, a possibility for real change, however small. Captain Bennett cleared her throat, refocusing the conversation. Agent Davis, if you're ready, we can set up the meeting with my officers. I want this to be a conversation that opens their eyes and shifts their perspectives. Marcus took a deep breath, the weight of the task settling on his shoulders. He nodded, his voice steady. I'm ready, Captain. It's not going to be easy, but if it can prevent incidents like today's, then it's worth it. Larkin placed a supportive hand on Marcus's shoulder. You've got my full backing, Marcus. Speak your truth, and don't hold back. With that, the three of them rose, a sense of purpose uniting them as they prepared for the meeting that would confront the unspoken prejudices within the precinct. Marcus knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, but this was a start, a small step toward dismantling the assumptions and biases that had shaped his experience today. As they left Captain Bennett's office and made their way toward the precinct, facing the force, the precinct's main conference room was large but austere, its walls a sterile white, adorned only with a few commendation plaques and awards. Rows of chairs were arranged in neat lines facing a podium at the front. Officer Jenkins had set up a projector, and a few officers were already filtering in, exchanging curious glances as they took their seats. Word had spread quickly that an FBI agent was going to address the precinct, and the officers were intrigued, if not slightly unsettled. Marcus Davis stood near the podium, feeling the weight of the room's attention even before it filled. He glanced over to Captain Bennett, who gave him a reassuring nod, and Sec. Larkin, who had insisted on staying as a show of solidarity. Larkin's presence served as both a support and a reminder that this was not a simple briefing. This was a reckoning of sorts, an opportunity to confront the ingrained biases that had led to his wrongful detention earlier that day. As more officers filed in, conversations hummed quietly around the room. Some of them stole glances at Marcus, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and skepticism. Officer Brian Harkins entered last, looking visibly uncomfortable. He chose a seat near the back, folding his arms tightly, as though physically shielding himself from what he knew was coming. When everyone was seated, Captain Bennett approached the podium. She scanned the room, her gaze stern, letting the silence settle before she spoke. Thank you all for gathering here on such short notice, she began. Today's session will be different from the usual briefings. We're here to confront a situation that happened within our own precinct, a situation that should never have occurred. Her words were direct, her tone unforgiving, and the room seemed to collectively tense. She continued, This morning, one of our officers, while patrolling Riverside Park, wrongfully detained a man with no justifiable cause. That man, as some of you may have already heard, is Special Agent Marcus Davis of the FBI. There were murmurs of surprise and some shuffling in seats as the gravity of the situation sank in. Marcus could see Brian Harkins shifting uncomfortably in his chair, his face turning slightly pale. The other officers looked between Captain Bennett and Marcus, visibly grappling with the implications. Captain Bennett gestured for Marcus to step forward. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of 100 pairs of eyes on him, each gaze carrying its own blend of emotions: curiosity, guilt, defensiveness, and perhaps a hint of embarrassment. He approached the podium with an air of quiet strength, his expression composed but determined. Good afternoon, Marcus began, his voice steady, resonating through the quiet room. I'm Agent Marcus Davis. Some of you may have heard my name already, but for those who haven't, I've served with the FBI for over 15 years, specializing in organized crime and counterterrorism. I've worked in situations that demanded the highest levels of trust, cooperation, and mutual respect with law enforcement agencies across the country. He paused. Agent Davis, she began, her voice respectful but earnest. I understand that what happened to you was wrong, and I think we all recognize that now. But how can we, as officers, become better at recognizing and overcoming these biases? It's one thing to say we need to change, but how do we actually do it? Marcus appreciated her honesty. That's a fair question, Officer Ramirez, he replied. The first step is awareness, acknowledging that biases exist within all of us. No one is immune. The second step is training, but not just the standard sessions we all go through. We need training that challenges us to confront our own assumptions and actively unlearn the prejudices we may have absorbed over time. He glanced around the room, making eye contact with as many officers as he could. But perhaps the most important step is empathy. Get to know the communities you serve. Talk to people from different backgrounds. Learn about their experiences. When we understand each other's stories, we're less likely to see each other as threats and more likely to see each other as human beings. The room was silent, many of the officers looking thoughtful, some even nodding in agreement. The uncomfortable truth in Marcus's words resonated with them, cutting through any lingering defensiveness. Just then, Sack Larkin stood up, adding his own voice to the conversation. Agent Davis is right. In the Bureau, we're trained to recognize that our biases can be a liability. Law enforcement isn't just about enforcing the law. It's about building trust. And that trust is fragile. It can be shattered in a single moment of misjudgment. It's our job, not just as officers, but as people, to ensure that we don't allow our own prejudices to undermine that trust. Larkin's words carried weight, his presence lending authority to Marcus's message. Brian Harkins, sitting at the back, was visibly affected. His usual bravado had crumbled, leaving him with a mix of shame and regret. He hadn't intended for things to go this far, hadn't anticipated that his actions would be scrutinized so intensely. Yet, as he listened to Marcus, he began to see his own behavior from a new perspective, one that was deeply uncomfortable but necessary. Captain Bennett stepped forward once more, her tone resolute. From this day forward, we will be implementing new training sessions focused on addressing implicit biases. These will be mandatory for everyone in this precinct, myself included. But training alone isn't enough. I expect each and every one of you to carry this conversation with you into your work, to let it inform the way you interact with the people in our community. She turned to Marcus, her gaze steady. Agent Davis, thank you for your courage in sharing your experiences with us. Your words have given us insight that we cannot ignore, and I assure you, this precinct will be better because of it. Marcus inclined his head, gratitude evident in his expression. He knew that change wouldn't happen overnight, but seeing the openness of Captain Bennett and the officers in the room gave him a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this conversation would be the start of something meaningful. As the meeting concluded, officers began to disperse, many of them approaching Marcus with words of thanks or apologies. Some offered handshakes, others simply nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the respect they now felt for him. Brian Harkins lingered at the back, watching the scene unfold with a mixture of guilt and introspection. Finally, he gathered the courage to approach Marcus, his face tense but determined. Agent Davis, he began, his voice quieter than usual. I owe you an apology. I was wrong. I acted on my own prejudices, and I see that now. I can't undo what happened, but I want you to know that I'm going to do better. I won't let something like this happen again. Marcus regarded him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he extended a hand. Acknowledging the mistake is the first step, Officer Harkins. The real work begins now. Brian nodded, accepting the handshake, a flicker of relief in his eyes. The two men stood there, a silent understanding passing between them, a commitment to change, not just in words but in action. As Marcus left the precinct that day, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He knew there was still much to be done, but he also knew he had planted a seed. Change was slow, often. The ripple effect. The days following Marcus's address to the precinct were filled with tension, introspection, and, for some, resistance. The incident had ignited a fire within the precinct, challenging officers to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and the role of prejudice within their profession. Officer Brian Harkins, in particular, found himself at the center of this shift, navigating a personal reckoning he hadn't anticipated. After their public confrontation and Marcus's powerful speech, Brian couldn't shake the shame and guilt that lingered. Every time he put on his uniform, he was reminded of his actions in Riverside Park, the assumptions he'd made, the authority he'd abused, and the dignity he'd stripped from a man who was, in many ways, his equal. The thought gnawed at him, leaving him restless, questioning his instincts, and forcing him to acknowledge biases he had long tried to ignore. Captain Bennett, true to her word, had organized a series of mandatory workshops and seminars focused on implicit bias and cultural sensitivity, starting with the precinct's senior officers. These sessions were led by experts in the field, individuals who held no affiliation with the police department and who brought with them stories and experiences that shattered preconceptions. Some officers chafed at the sessions, seeing them as punitive, but most, after hearing Marcus's story and seeing his dignity firsthand, found themselves listening, learning, and reflecting. During one of these sessions, Brian found himself seated next to Officer Ramirez, the young woman who had asked Marcus how they could change. She was one of the precinct's rising stars, known for her dedication and her connection to the community. Brian noticed how intently she listened, her eyes focused and her posture open, taking in every word the instructor shared. Her presence made him feel both inspired and uneasy. She seemed to represent the new generation of law enforcement, a generation he felt increasingly out of touch with. "Brian," Ramirez said during a break, breaking the silence that hung between them, "how are you holding up?" Brian shifted uncomfortably, not used to such direct questions. "Honestly, it's a lot. Makes you question everything you thought you knew." She nodded, her gaze thoughtful. "I get that. But isn't that the point? To make us better, even if it's uncomfortable." Brian forced a small smile. "I suppose you're right. I guess I've spent so long doing things a certain way that it's hard to see past it." Ramirez leaned in, her expression serious. "The thing is, we're in a position of power. People look at us and see authority, sometimes even fear. It's up to us to make sure they see respect and integrity instead. That's why Marcus's story hits so hard. It's a reminder of the responsibility we carry." Her words struck a chord within him, and for the first time, Brian felt the stirrings of something he hadn't expected, an urge to understand, to learn, to change. He realized that he'd been viewing Marcus as the end of a lesson rather than the beginning. Marcus's story was the spark, but the real transformation had to come from within him and the decisions he made moving forward. Later that evening, Brian found himself pacing in his small, dimly lit apartment. The events of the past week replayed in his mind, each memory pressing on him with a force he could no longer ignore. He thought about his first years on the force, when he'd been young, idealistic, and eager to serve. He remembered his rookie training officer, a hardened man named Thompson, who had instilled in him the belief that the world was black and white, good and evil. Back then, Brian had accepted it without question, allowing that rigid worldview to shape his career. But now, after confronting his own actions, he saw the world in shades of gray. His encounter with Marcus had stripped away the simplicity he once clung to, leaving him with an unsettling truth. The system he served wasn't always just, and sometimes he, too, had played a part in that injustice. For the first time, he began to question not only his own biases, but also the culture within the precinct, the silent codes and unspoken rules that had guided his actions for so many years. As he grappled with these thoughts, he realized that he needed to speak to Marcus, not as an apology, but as a step toward understanding. He didn't know if Marcus would even want to see him, but he felt that if he didn't reach out, he'd be left with an emptiness that would never heal. The next morning, Brian gathered his courage and reached out to Captain Bennett, explaining his desire to meet with Marcus again. She listened quietly, her face betraying little emotion, but there was a flicker of approval in her eyes. "Marcus isn't one to hold grudges," she said after a pause. I think he'd be open to meeting, especially if he knows it's coming from a genuine place. She made the arrangements, and later that afternoon, Brian found himself outside a nondescript office building, where Marcus was temporarily stationed. His palms were sweaty, his heart pounding in his chest. It was strange, he thought, to feel so nervous about a simple conversation. But he understood that this was more than just a meeting. It was a moment of reckoning. Marcus greeted him at the door, his demeanor calm and reserved. They exchanged a brief handshake, and Marcus gestured for him to take a seat across from him. The office was minimalistic: a desk, a few chairs, and a large window that overlooked the bustling city streets. Brian sat, suddenly feeling very small, as though he were an errant student called to the principal's office. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me," Brian began, his voice wavering slightly. I wanted to talk, to understand what happened in the park. It opened my eyes to a lot of things I'd been avoiding." Marcus regarded him quietly, his expression thoughtful. "I appreciate that, Officer Harkins. This isn't an easy conversation, and I respect that you're willing to have it." Brian nodded, swallowing his nerves. "I guess I've been blind, for lack of a better word. Blind to the way I've been looking at people, judging them without really seeing them. You were just a man reading a book, but I saw something else, something that wasn't there. And I need to understand why." Marcus leaned back in his chair, considering his words carefully. "It takes courage to admit that, Brian. But understanding why requires you to go beyond just this one incident. It's about examining the beliefs you've held, the influences that have shaped you, and being willing to dismantle them. That's not something that happens overnight." Brian nodded, absorbing the weight of Marcus's words. "When I was starting out, I had this idea that being a cop meant being tough, showing no weakness, trusting my instincts above all else. But now I realize that my instincts aren't always right, that they've been shaped by biases I didn't even know I had." Marcus's gaze softened slightly, a hint of empathy shining through. "You're not the only one, Brian. We all have biases. It's part of being human. But it's our responsibility, especially in this line of work, to be aware of those biases and to challenge them. Because when we don't, we risk harming the very people we're meant to protect." Brian felt a surge of guilt and remorse, but also a newfound determination. "I want to change, Marcus. I want to be better, not just for myself, but for the people I serve. I know it won't be easy, and I know I've got a lot of work to do, but I'm willing to put in the effort." Marcus nodded, his expression approving. "That's all anyone can ask, Brian. Change is hard, but it's worth it. And if you're committed to this journey, I believe you'll make a difference." They sat in silence for a moment, a mutual respect settling between them. Brian felt a weight lift from his shoulders, a sense of clarity and purpose he hadn't felt in years. He knew that this conversation wouldn't erase the mistakes of his past, but it was a step toward redemption, a step toward becoming the man he wanted to be. As their conversation came to an end, Marcus extended his hand once more. This time, Brian shook it with a sense of genuine gratitude, recognizing the significance of the gesture. Marcus wasn't just forgiving him. He was offering him a chance to rebuild, to start anew. Leaving the office, Brian felt a strange mix of relief and resolve. He had a long road ahead, filled with uncomfortable truths and difficult changes, but for the first time, he felt ready to face it. Marcus had shown him not only the flaws in his own perspective, but also the potential for growth and transformation. It was a gift he hadn't expected, but one he would carry with him, using it as fuel for the journey ahead. Back at the precinct, Brian shared his experience with his fellow officers, speaking openly about his conversation with Marcus and the realizations he'd had. Some listened with skepticism, others with admiration, but Brian didn't care. He was no longer driven by the need for approval or validation. He was driven by a desire to make amends, to reshape his career and his character. In the weeks that followed, he became a vocal advocate for the training sessions, encouraging his colleagues to confront their own biases. He volunteered to participate in community outreach programs, spending time in neighborhoods he once viewed with suspicion, listening to the stories of the people who lived there, understanding their lives and struggles. Word of his transformation spread, and slowly Brian began to notice a shift in his colleagues' attitudes as the road to redemption. Months passed, and the precinct was no longer the same. What had started as a ripple, one incident that forced an uncomfortable conversation, had become a wave of transformation. Officers were now engaging in community outreach, attending training sessions, and fostering a new level of accountability and empathy within their ranks. The incident with Marcus Davis had marked a turning point, not just for Officer Brian Harkins, but for everyone in the precinct. And in the middle of this change was Brian, a man who had once been at the heart of the issue, now striving to become part of the solution. The personal journey Brian undertook was far from easy. Every day was a lesson in humility, a reminder that growth often comes from facing the parts of ourselves we'd rather ignore. There were days when his old habits and reflexes kicked in, days when he caught himself falling into patterns of suspicion and judgment. But he had learned to recognize these moments, to pause, reflect, and reorient himself. It was a constant battle, but he was willing to fight it. One Friday evening, the precinct held an open forum at a local community center. It was an idea Captain Bennett and Marcus had brainstormed together, an opportunity for the community to meet with officers in a neutral setting, to voice their concerns, and to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the people they served. The forum had been advertised for weeks, and the anticipation around it was palpable. People were curious, hopeful, and perhaps even a bit skeptical, wondering if the precinct's promises of change would actually amount to anything. Brian arrived early, setting up chairs and organizing materials with a few other officers. He felt a familiar nervousness gnawing at him, a fear that no matter what he said, people would still see him as the man who had wrongfully detained an innocent black man in a park. But he reminded himself that this event wasn't about his comfort. It was about facing that discomfort, embracing it, and using it as a foundation for genuine change. As the community members started to arrive, Brian scanned the crowd, recognizing familiar faces from the neighborhoods he patrolled. Some were people he'd met through outreach programs, people whose stories had gradually reshaped his worldview. And then, near the back of the room, he spotted Marcus, standing with Zach Larkin, a quiet observer in the sea of faces. Their eyes met, and Marcus offered a nod, a silent acknowledgement that Brian was exactly where he needed to be. The event began with Captain Bennett taking the podium, her presence strong and confident as she introduced herself and the purpose of the evening. She spoke about the precinct's commitment to transparency, accountability, and community engagement. She acknowledged past mistakes, not only those made by individuals, but also the broader systemic issues that had created distrust. "We are here to listen," she said, her gaze steady as it swept over the audience. "We are here to hear your stories, your concerns, and to answer your questions. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it begins with conversations like these." The room was filled with a quiet tension, a mixture of hope and hesitance. For some, this was the first time they'd seen law enforcement take such an open, vulnerable stance, and they weren't quite sure what to make of it. But as the evening unfolded, people began to speak up, sharing stories of both positive and negative encounters with police, describing their frustrations, their fears, and their hopes for a better relationship with the officers who patrolled their neighborhoods. Brian listened intently, absorbing every word, feeling the weight of the trust these people were placing in him and his colleagues. When it was his turn to speak, he took a deep breath, standing before a room full of people who had every reason to be wary of him. He looked over at Marcus once more, drawing strength from the silent encouragement in his eyes. "My name is Officer Brian Harkins," he began, his voice steady but filled with sincerity. "Some of you may know me, and some of you may not. But for those who do, I want to acknowledge that I haven't always been the officer you deserve. In fact, a few months ago, I made a mistake, a mistake born out of bias, out of assumptions I'd held for far too long. There was a murmur in the room, a shift in the energy as people leaned in to listen. Brian continued, his gaze unwavering. I detained an innocent man in a public park, a man who was simply enjoying a quiet afternoon. I let my own prejudices cloud my judgment, and that's something I deeply regret. That man was Agent Marcus Davis of the FBI, and he's here with us tonight. All eyes turned to Marcus, who gave a small nod of acknowledgement but stayed seated, allowing Brian to continue. I've spent the last few months examining my actions, attending training sessions, and working to rebuild the trust I broke. I know that words alone aren't enough, and that's why I'm here tonight, to listen, to learn, and to show you that I'm committed to being the officer you deserve. I may never be able to fully undo the harm I caused, but I promise to spend the rest of my career making amends, one day at a time. The room was silent for a moment, and then, slowly, a hand rose from the back. It was an elderly man, a longtime resident of the neighborhood, who'd had his own share of run-ins with the law over the years. He looked at Brian with a mixture of skepticism and guarded respect. Officer Harkins, the man said, his voice carrying a lifetime of hard-won wisdom. For years, we've seen officers come through here, promising change, but never delivering. What makes you any different? Brian took a deep breath, meeting the man's gaze directly. I can't speak for the others, sir. All I can tell you is that this experience has changed me, and it's opened my eyes to things I was blind to before. I know trust isn't given, it's earned. And I'm here to earn it, however long it takes. The man studied him, then gave a slow nod, his expression softening just a bit. I'll hold you to that, officer. Don't make me regret it. Brian smiled, a genuine, relieved smile. I won't, sir. As the night went on, more voices emerged, people sharing their own experiences and concerns. Officers took notes, asked questions, and engaged in discussions that were sometimes tense, sometimes cathartic. Marcus, who stayed at the back for most of the evening, observed with a quiet sense of pride. He knew that change was often incremental, and that even the smallest steps forward could have lasting impacts. Toward the end of the night, Captain Bennett invited Marcus to speak. He rose, moving to the front of the room, and addressed the gathering with the calm authority that had become his hallmark. Thank you for allowing me to be part of this tonight, he began. What happened between Officer Harkins and me was painful, but it was also necessary. Sometimes it takes a hard experience to reveal the cracks in a system. And while I wish things had unfolded differently, I'm grateful for the change that has followed. He looked directly at Brian, offering a nod of respect. Officer Harkins took accountability for his actions, and that's something I respect deeply. But the real change doesn't end with him. It's a collective responsibility. We all have biases, we all have blind spots, and it's our duty to confront them, especially in this line of work. He turned his attention back to the community members. You have every right to hold us accountable, to demand better. Change is a two-way street, and your voices are just as important as ours in this journey. The room erupted into applause, a powerful display of appreciation and hope. For the first time, it felt as if the precinct and the community were aligned, united by a shared commitment to justice, accountability, and mutual respect. Marcus's words resonated, creating a ripple effect that seemed to cement the changes already underway. As the forum came to a close, Brian approached Marcus, gratitude evident in his eyes. Thank you, Marcus, for everything. Marcus smiled, extending a hand. This isn't the end, Brian. It's just the beginning. Keep doing the work, keep listening, and you'll make a difference. They shook hands, a gesture that symbolized not only reconciliation, but also a partnership in the shared mission of building a better, more just society. As they parted ways, Brian felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that his journey was far from over, but that he was on the right path. In the weeks and months that followed, Brian continued to work tirelessly to rebuild trust within the community. He volunteered for every community event, every outreach opportunity, determined to show through his actions that he was a changed man. Slowly, he began to see the walls of distrust erode, replaced by genuine relationships, respect, and even friendship with people he had once viewed with suspicion. And through it all, Marcus remained a steady presence in his life, a mentor and a friend, always reminding him that the journey of self-awareness and change was ongoing. For Brian, this experience was more than just a lesson. It was a transformation, one that reshaped not only his career, but also his identity as a man, as an officer, and as a member of his community. What had begun as a moment of prejudice had blossomed into a movement of empathy and understanding, a testament to the power of accountability and the resilience of the human spirit. Brian Harkins was no longer just a police officer. He was a symbol of change, a beacon of hope for a future where justice truly served all.